Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome. Professor Bush, I'd like to start with you. If I could direct your attention to the part of your testimony that specifically refers to the expansion of these waivers and the implication on national security. If you would please elaborate on how it is you perceive that these waivers could lead to China's work at undermining the United States competitiveness and how that affects our overall national security.
The flow of technologies will undermine U.S. competitiveness, but on the national security front, think about it this way. In the past few years, all since COVID, China has waged political trade wars on Australia, Canada, Lithuania, and now the company Micron Technologies. In pursuit of levers in these trade spats, the idea of having a market concentration in any given technology will facilitate that type of economic coercion. It's not new, but it's really come online in a very big way. I'd point out that both the FBI and Britain's MI5 have concluded that this is already happening, and that as a result, you have the European Union recently legislating what they call an anti-coercion instrument. These are tough times in a lot of ways, but the more that China dominates certain of these sectors of biopharma, the more leverage they'll have through economic coercion, which implicates, of course, U.S. national security.
And if you would elaborate for us on what are some of the strategies you think the United States should be implementing to help combat this effort at economic coercion here at home?
Well, first, we have to do something that kind of looks like what Europe has been up to, namely thinking about ways to mitigate those disputes that are purely political and have nothing to do with economics. So, for example, Canada arrested a relative of a Huawei senior executive, and China banned canola exports from a given Canadian company in response. Australia asked for a global study of the origins of COVID, and China went into a full-fledged trade war with Australia. We have to have mechanisms that allow us to respond to these coercion efforts and do so in a way that is transparent in the eyes of our allies. Because the worst thing in the world would be to lose the faith of our allies as we deal with Chinese aggression.
Thank you. And Ambassador Shea, I'd like to turn back to a point that you raised earlier related to the potential scope of these waivers if expanded. You touched on the notion that these waivers could implicate more than just COVID-related technology or therapeutics, but could actually implicate a broader philosophical construct that covers things like climate change mitigation and other technology. Share with us more your perspective on that subject.
Well, thank you for the question. I included in my written testimony a reference to a statement by the existing WTO Director General, who took a very active role in pushing the waiver through the ministerial. Usually the WTO is considered a member-driven organization, but I think in this instance around the waiver, she seemed to have played a very active role in shaping the outcome. But when she was asked in London recently about extending the waiver to climate change mitigation technologies, according to the report I read, she says, "I could not agree more. We're going to see more of this type of argument, and I hope we'll find a way, because really trade needs to help spread green technologies." So there are members of the WTO, for example, India, who would love to jump on that bandwagon. So it is a slippery slope, which unfortunately this precedent with the COVID-19 vaccines waiver has set.
And you touched a moment ago on the concept of our dependence on China as it relates to life-saving drugs. Tell us, if you will, about that dependence and what steps you think we could be taking now to try to mitigate that vulnerability.
Well, I think we need to, I don't know if the federal government or the executive branch has actually done an assessment of what our dependencies are. I think the first thing to do, not just on pharmaceuticals, but in other areas, is to assess what are we really dependent on? What is critical to us, and what are our dependencies? You know, in the military has subcomponents, thousands of subcomponents in very high-tech missile systems And I don't think we know where all these subcomponents are sourced. And I assume some are from China. So that is very, very perturbing. If I may, I'll just go back to if I may, on the question that you asked my colleague. I mean, you could have also added Philippines, Korea, and Japan to the countries that have been subject to Chinese trade coercion as a result of a political position that they've taken. And in terms of working with our allies, there is an idea that two people I respect, Rob Atkinson of ITIF and Clyde Prestowitz, have floated of forming a DATO, defense, I forget what DATO specifically refers to, what the acronym refers to, but it's basically getting allies together to collectively respond to coercive trade acts directed at one of the members. So I think that's something that should be explored further.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.